Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you on this sunny Sunday afternoon and to celebrate 40 years of being in this building. That is quite something, isn't it? And for those of you who don't know who I am, if I'm a strange face to you, you might think that's a very strange face. My name's Ian White, I'm the senior minister here. So if it all goes wrong, it's my fault, basically. And yet it's wonderful to be here today to thank God for 40 years of faithful ministry in this building. Of course, it was put up in 1973, and in 1973 things were very different from what they are today. In 1973, oh, you're taking a picture. That's going to be over YouTube later on. Actually, this is my best side. Sorry? George wouldn't have done that, no. Sorry, I don't have the glasses. In 1973, there were only 3 TV channels anybody could watch in Great Britain. BBC One, BBC Two and ITV. In 1973, the price of a gallon of petrol was 38 pence. That's a gallon. That makes it 8.4p per litre. Get your head around that. In 1973, an obscure American engineer said, "For 100 years we have been trapped in our homes and leashed to our desks by a piece of copper wire. Now it is the time to set us free." And the first mobile phone call in human history was made in 1973. Ryan Giggs was born in 1973. Pizza Hut opened its first restaurant in 1973. How things have changed. Actually, of course, in 1973, Ted Heath was trying to legislate to stop companies shuffling their money to offshore tax havens. And he called it the unacceptable face of capitalism. Maybe there are 1 or 2 things that don't change in 40 years. But in these 40 years, these walls have been soaked with prayer. This platform has been the place where people have heard about Jesus Christ, from which they have worshipped him. And it's been a fascinating journey. Victoria Baptist Church actually started on the 10th of March 1926 as Victoria Drive Baptist Church, and there were only 29 people there. But from those small beginnings came what we know today. The methods may have changed, the decor may have changed, the music almost certainly has changed, but the message has not. And neither has the power of the gospel to transform ordinary human beings like you and me to be the people that God always made us to be. Well, we're talking about 40 years, and for those of you for whom that little joke about George went phew, George Cummings was the minister here for 40 years and oversaw the transition from the building in Victoria Drive to where we are today. Ray Brown followed him. In fact, I have a letter sent to Corrie Paxton by Ray Brown. In it he said this: "The delight for me in coming to Victoria was inheriting so many superb evangelistic and teaching opportunities already in full flow when I came to the church. Inspiring worship, relevant teaching, holistic evangelism have always been what the church stands for." When I came here, my predecessor, John Murray, was still in the congregation, and he graciously became one of our pastoral associates and did so much visiting and pastoral work to free me to begin with the other leaders to bring about some of the changes that we knew were necessary at the time. So as your minister today, I can say honestly, my friends, I know that I stand on the shoulders of giants. And the fact that we can sit here 40 years after this church was first opened and still rejoice in what God has done is a testimony both to their faithfulness and to your faithfulness too. Because I know there are some of us here who were there on that first day. When we look back at 40 years, it's often very difficult to try and get a handle on exactly what we should talk about. And I think in the very early story of the children of Israel, that was the case for Moses. And if when you heard that reading that Michael Fleetwood read to us so beautifully earlier on, you thought that's a bit of a left of field reading for an occasion like this, then you're probably right. But you see, the book of Deuteronomy is a bit of a retrospective. When we look back at a period of time, we try to make sense of it all. We try to understand it. And what God is helping the children of Israel to do in the book of Deuteronomy is to look back on part of their history and make some sense of it. It's a retrospective. So just to give you a bit of backstory, the children of Israel as a nation had been wandering through the desert. And the reason they'd been wandering through the desert was very simple. God had promised them a new land. A land, he said, quoted, flowing with milk and honey. And of course those were two rare and precious commodities in those times. This would be a land full of opulence. It would be a land full of profit. It would be a land full of prestige. And so in order to get the children of Israel fully to understand the grandeur of the new land that God was leading them into, he got them to send 12 men, 12 representatives, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, into the new land to do a reconnoitre and to bring back some information and some news and some fruit about what was going to be there. And so these 12 men set out. And their purpose was to bring back evidence of how good God was going to be. Now, any of you who know the story will know that when they came back, 10 of them brought back a very bad report. Only 2 of them said, hey, you know what? We can go up and possess the land. And because those 10 men brought back a bad report of God's good land, the whole of the nation wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And it was only 40 years later that they got into the land God had promised them. Now, it would be easy for anyone, particularly those of us of a half-empty glass disposition, to look back on those 40 years and say, this was a complete waste of time. What was the point? But God wanted them to look back on this period with a very different pair of eyes. You see, during that wilderness trip, it hadn't been a waste of time. God had given them the tabernacle with all of its wonderful symbolism about who he is and how to worship him. He taught them how to worship, how to meet with God corporately. He'd given them the law, the 10 Commandments and all the other stuff that's contained in the law of Moses. He provided food for them miraculously. They'd come out in the morning and they'd scrape this stuff off the land. They didn't quite know what it was. And so they used the Hebrew word for what is it, which is manna. And this became known as manna. Every time they got up in the morning, they manna, manna, manna. What on earth is this stuff? And yet they ate it and it fed them while they were in the wilderness. He provided food miraculously. He set up a system of priests and leaders to govern the nation, as well as a judicial system which contains some of the principles that we still use today in our judiciary. This was not dead time. This was no waste. And so in that passage that Michael read to us earlier on, what you have is God's summary of those 40 years. And here it is on the screen. Perhaps if you can see it, you'd like to read it with me. The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He has watched over your journey through this vast desert. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything. You are not a waste of time, says God. I do not see this as the squandering of 40 years. And you know, when I read those verses, my heart leapt a beat. And I thought, God, I know you want to say this to Victoria. When we look back over 40 years, Victoria, God has blessed the work of your hands. And it has been hard work. It's part of our Baptist heritage that the local church is self-financing and self-operating. Every penny of these buildings, the cost of these buildings, was given by people in the church. There are no denominational funds that underwrite all that we do. It is your sacrificial giving and your consistent work that has brought us to this point. Victoria, well done. And then look at what else God says. Victoria, God has watched over your journey. I'm sadly part, occasionally, of churches that are dying. And I see churches where their buildings are emptying, where they're having to sell them off. You cannot say that of what God's done here at Victoria, and we give him the credit for it. Our journey has not always been predictable or easy, but God has never let us down. And then taking the next phrase, Victoria, God has been with you these 40 years. Yes, what we do and the way we do it looks very different. To be perfectly honest, I think George will be horrified to see what we've seen today. And yet I think his heart and Ray's and John's and other staff who've been with us would say, if you are seeking to communicate Christ powerfully and relevantly, then I'm there. The message of the gospel is just the same. And then the last one, you have not lacked anything. Oh, it's easy to say, yes, if we'd had more money we could have done more stuff. Anybody can say that. But I can look back over the years that I've been here, and we can look back over the 40 years and say, when it comes down to it, there has not been a lack. God has provided. And he's been the one to whom we give all the glory. So we have a lot to give thanks for in the past 40 years. And in a few minutes, I'm going to come and tell you what's going to happen in the next 40.